I was sitting in my kitchen drinking coffee when I saw three people wrestling my brand new Polaris snow machine onto a flatbed trailer. And the woman directing them was wearing a neon orange vest that said HOA Board President, like it was some kind of law enforcement badge. My name is Derek Zimmerman, and I had just moved to Fairbanks, Alaska, 6 months ago after selling my software company in Seattle. I bought a beautiful 5-acre property on the outskirts of town, part of the Birchwood Estates development. The place was perfect. A custom log home, spectacular views of the Alaska Range, and most importantly, direct access to thousands of acres of Bureau of Land Management trails that connected right to my back property line. I had spent $30,000 on that snow machine specifically because I wanted to explore those trails all winter. I ran outside without even grabbing a jacket, which was stupid because it was negative 15 degrees that morning. "Hey, what the hell are you doing with my property?" The woman in the vest turned around, and I got my first good look at her. She was probably in her mid-50s, with short blonde hair that looked like she paid way too much to maintain it, and she had this expression on her face like she smelled something rotten. "Mr. Zimmerman, I presume." "Yeah, and you're stealing my snow machine. Want to explain that before I call the cops?" She pulled out a folder from under her vest, somehow managing to look smug despite the cold. "I'm Patricia Hendricks, president of the Birchwood Estates Homeowners Association. This vehicle was found trespassing on HOA property, specifically on our community trail system. According to Article 7, Section 3 of your HOA agreement, any vehicle found in violation of community rules can be impounded until such violations are remedied and appropriate fines are paid. Community trail system. That trail goes onto BLM land. I checked the maps before I even bought this place." Patricia smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made you want to take a step back. "The trailhead and the first quarter mile are on HOA property, Mr. Zimmerman. You signed an agreement when you purchased your home that you would not use motorized vehicles on any HOA trails. It's quite clearly stated." I felt my face getting hot despite the cold. I bought this place specifically for trail access. The realtor never said anything about not being able to use the trails. What your realtor did or did not tell you is not the HOA's problem. The covenant is legally binding. She nodded to the two men who had finished securing my snow machine. "The impound fee is $500, plus $50 per day storage, plus the initial fine of $2,000 for covenant violation. You can retrieve your vehicle once all fees are paid in full." This is insane. That trail is the only access to BLM land from this entire area. Then perhaps you should have read your HOA documents more carefully before purchasing. Patricia turned to walk away, then stopped and looked back. "Oh, and Mr. Zimmerman, if we catch that vehicle on HOA property again, the fine doubles. Have a nice day." I stood there in my t-shirt and jeans, watching them drive away with my snow machine, so angry I could barely think straight. My hands were starting to go numb. So I finally went back inside and immediately started digging through the massive stack of paperwork from when I bought the house. I had signed so many documents that day that my hand cramped. There had to be something in there that would prove this was wrong. It took me 2 hours of reading through dense legal language before I found it. Buried on page 47 of the Covenant Conditions and Restrictions, in tiny print, there it was. No motorized vehicles including but not limited to ATVs, UTVs, snow machines, dirt bikes, or similar recreational vehicles shall be operated on any HOA-maintained trails or common areas. I slammed the document down on my desk. The realtor, a cheerful woman named Sandy, had absolutely not mentioned this. She had specifically pointed out the trail access as a major selling point. I called her immediately. "Sandy, this is Derek Zimmerman. We need to talk about the HOA restrictions you failed to mention." There was a pause. "Derek, hi. What restrictions are you referring to? The fact that I cannot use motorized vehicles on the trails. You know, the trails you told me were the best feature of the property." Her voice got small. "Oh, that. Derek, I'm so sorry. I honestly thought that only applied to the internal neighborhood streets. I didn't realize the trail was considered HOA property. They just impounded my $30,000 Snowmachine and are charging me $2,500 to get it back. That's terrible. But Derek, everything was disclosed in the HOA documents. I gave you the full packet. A packet of 200 pages of legal documents that nobody could reasonably read in the 3 hours before closing. I understand you're upset, but legally, I provided all required disclosures. I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do." I hung up before I said something I would regret. My next call was to a real estate attorney in Fairbanks named Michael Chen. His receptionist said he could see me that afternoon. Chen's office was in downtown Fairbanks, in one of those professional buildings that tried to look rustic, but just ended up looking corporate. He was younger than I expected, maybe in his late 30s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a firm handshake. "So tell me what happened," he said, pulling out a legal pad. I explained the whole situation, showed him the covenant, and showed him the property maps I had pulled from the county records. He studied everything carefully, making notes. "Okay," he finally said. "The bad news is the covenant is legitimate and legally binding. You did sign it, even if you didn't read every page. The HOA has the right to enforce their rules. And the good news? The good news is that HOA rules have to be applied fairly and consistently. If they're letting other residents do things they're not letting you do, that's selective enforcement, which you can challenge. Also, those fees seem excessive. We might be able to argue they're punitive rather than compensatory. What do I need to do? First, I need you to document everything. Take photos of the trail, note if you see any other motorized vehicles on HOA property, attend their next board meeting and formally protest. Build a paper trail. Second, let me draft a letter to the HOA explaining that you believe they're acting in bad faith and that we're prepared to take legal action if necessary. How much is this going to cost me? My retainer is $5,000. If this goes to actual litigation, it could run $20,000 to $30,000, maybe more. I felt sick. So I was looking at potentially $50,000 or more just to get my Snowmachine back and be able to use my own property the way I intended. Let me think about it. Don't think too long. Those storage fees are adding up every day. I left his office feeling worse than when I arrived. I drove home and spent the rest of the afternoon staring at my property maps, trying to figure out if there was any other way to access the BLM trails. That's when I noticed something interesting. My property was shaped like a rough rectangle, about 300 yards wide and 700 yards deep. The back property line ran right along the edge of BLM land. But the trail that the HOA claimed ownership of curved through the neighborhood, passed within 50 feet of my property line, then continued onto BLM land. What I hadn't noticed before was that according to the county maps, there was a second trail, an older trail that was barely visible on satellite imagery that also connected to the BLM land system. And that older trail crossed through a narrow piece of land that appeared to be mine. I pulled up the property survey I had received at closing and spread it out on my kitchen table. The survey showed my back property line in detail, with metal stakes marking the corners. And sure enough, There was a notation about an existing trail easement that crossed the back corner of my property. But here was the interesting part. The notation said the easement was for access to federal lands and was established in 1987 when this area was first subdivided. It didn't say anything about who could use it or under what conditions. I grabbed my warmest coat, my boots, and my phone and hiked out to my back property. The temperature had dropped to -20, and the sun was already starting to set even though it was only 3 in the afternoon. Alaska in January is no joke. It took me 30 minutes of trudging through snow to reach my back property line. The metal stakes were right where the survey said they would be, marked with little orange flags. And there, just barely visible under a layer of snow and overgrown brush, was an old trail. It was narrow, maybe 6 feet wide, and it curved away from my property onto what I was pretty sure was BLM land. I followed it for about a quarter mile, checking my GPS app against the county property maps. The trail definitely crossed my property, then continued onto federal land, eventually connecting with the main trail system about a mile away. I stood there in the fading light, my breath coming out in clouds, and started to form a plan. Back at home, I spent the evening researching easement law in Alaska. What I found was fascinating. An easement for access to federal lands typically meant that the property owner could not block access, but it didn't necessarily mean that everyone had the right to use it. Some easements were public, some were private, and some were what's called appurtenant, meaning they existed for the benefit of specific adjacent properties. I needed to find out exactly what kind of easement this was. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office and requested all documents related to my property's easement. The clerk, a friendly older man with a thick gray beard, pulled up the records. "Here we go," he said, squinting at his computer screen. "Easement established October 1987. Let's see. It's described as a private access easement for lot owners in the original Birchwood subdivision for the purpose of accessing Federal Bureau of Land Management lands. Grantee is. Looks like it lists the original subdivision owners, and it says, and their heirs and assigns. So it's private, not public. That's what it says. Private easement for property owners in the subdivision. What about the HOA? Are they mentioned anywhere?" He scrolled through the document. "Nope. This easement was established before the HOA existed. The HOA wasn't incorporated until 1994, according to these records." I felt a smile starting to form. So the HOA doesn't have any legal claim to this easement. Not unless it was specifically transferred to them, which I'm not seeing in these documents. But I'm not a lawyer, so don't take my word as legal advice. Can I get copies of everything? Sure thing. Give me a few minutes. I left the recorder's office with a folder full of documents and a plan forming in my mind. The HOA had seized my Snowmachine for using what they claimed was their trail. But I had my own trail, one that they had no legal authority over. And if that trail happened to be the only reasonable access point to the BLM lands from the entire Birchwood Estates development, well, that was just an interesting coincidence. I called Michael Chen from my truck. "I need you to research something for me. I found an easement on my property that I think changes everything." I met with him again that afternoon and showed him what I had found. He studied the documents carefully, cross-referencing them with the HOA covenants and the property maps. "This is good," he finally said. "This easement predates the HOA by 7 years, and it's specifically designated as private access for subdivision lot owners. The HOA has no explicit authority over it. So, I can use it. You can use it because it's on your property. The question is whether other people can use it without your permission. What if I said they couldn't? Chen looked up at me sharply. You want to block access? The HOA blocked my access to what I thought was a public trail. Turns out I have my own trail, and I'm wondering what happens if I decide to make it private. You'd be well within your legal rights to control access to your own property. But Derek, this is going to make you very unpopular with your neighbors. My neighbors just stole my snow machine and are charging me $50 a day to hold it hostage. I'm not too worried about being popular. Chen leaned back in his chair. Okay, here's what I recommend. First, we need to establish clear property boundaries. Get a surveyor out there to mark the easement clearly. Second, we need to send a letter to the HOA informing them that you are asserting your property rights and that the easement across your land is private. Third, we install a gate. A gate at the point where the easement enters your property. Technically, you cannot block the easement entirely because other property owners in the original subdivision have rights to use it for access to BLM lands, but you absolutely can control how it's used. You can require permits, you can set hours of operation, you can establish rules about what vehicles are allowed. What about the HOA's trail, the one they claim is theirs? That's separate. But here's the thing. If your trail becomes the only practical access point because their trail is longer or more difficult, they're going to have to negotiate with you. And if they want to use my trail, they need to play by my rules. Exactly. But Derek, be prepared for this to get ugly. HOAs can be vindictive, and Patricia Hendricks sounds like the type who doesn't back down easily. Then it's a good thing I don't back down easily either. The next morning, I hired a local surveying company to come out and mark the easement boundaries. The surveyor, a burly guy named Tom who had lived in Fairbanks his whole life, tramped through my back property with his equipment, placing bright pink flags every 50 feet along the easement route. This is going to cause some drama, Tom said cheerfully as he worked. This trail is how half the neighborhood accesses the good snow machine trails. Yeah, well, the HOA should have thought about that before they stole my machine. Patricia Hendricks, you know her, Tom laughed. Everyone knows Patricia. She's been HOA president for 12 years. Woman's got nothing better to do than hassle people about their mailbox colors and whether their firewood is stacked neatly enough. Last year, she tried to fine my cousin because his truck was commercial looking. It was just a regular pickup with a toolbox. Sounds like a real peach. She's got an ego the size of Denali, thinks being HOA president makes her mayor or something. He pounded in another steak. Good luck with this, man. You're going to need it. After the survey was complete, I had a local contractor install a gate at the point where the easement entered my property from the neighborhood side. It was a substantial gate too, heavy-duty steel with a serious lock. I also installed 2 trail cameras pointed at the gate, so I would know if anyone tried to tamper with it. Then I made a sign. It was professionally printed, 2 feet by 3 feet, mounted on a post right next to the gate. Private property access to BLM trail system by permission. Only contact property owner for access permit. No trespassing violators will be prosecuted. Property owner Derek Zimmerman. I included my phone number and email address at the bottom. The sign went up on a Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, my phone started ringing. The first call was from a guy named Robert who lived 4 streets over. Hey, Derek, I'm calling about the gate you put up. That's the trail we all used to get to the BLM trails. You can't just block it off. I'm not blocking it off. I'm controlling access to my private property. But we've been using that trail for years. And you're welcome to continue using it. You just need to get a permit from me first. A permit? Are you serious? Completely serious. Come by tomorrow evening and we can discuss the terms." He hung up without saying goodbye. The second call was more aggressive. "Mr. Zimmerman, this is Patricia Hendricks. I understand you have erected an illegal gate blocking community access to public trails." "Hello, Patricia. Nice to hear from you. The gate is not illegal. It's on my private property and the trail is not public. It's a private easement established in 1987 for subdivision lot owners. That trail is community property and has been used by residents for decades. You cannot simply decide to block it." "I'm not blocking it. I'm regulating access, which is my right as the property owner. By the way, I'd like my snow machine back." "Your snow machine will be returned when you pay the required fees and fines." "Those fees are excessive and punitive. I'm not paying them." "Then your vehicle will remain in impound. And Mr. Zimmerman, if you do not remove that gate within 24 hours, the HOA will take legal action." "You do what you need to do, Patricia. I'll be here." She hung up and I couldn't help smiling. This was going exactly as I had planned. By Tuesday, I had received 14 calls and about 30 emails from residents asking about the gate. Most people were polite, explaining that they use the trail regularly and asking what they needed to do to get permission. A few were hostile, threatening to tear down the gate or sue me. I sent the same response to everyone. "Come to my house Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. for a community meeting to discuss trail access permits." Wednesday evening, 37 people showed up at my house. I had set up chairs in my large living room, but there weren't enough, so people stood along the walls and in the doorway. The mood was tense. Patricia Hendricks was there, of course, sitting in the front row with her arms crossed and a look on her face like she was at a funeral. Next to her was a thin man in his 60s who I later learned was Martin Hughes, the HOA vice president. There was also a woman in her 40s taking notes who turned out to be the HOA secretary, Brenda Walsh. I stood at the front of the room and waited for everyone to settle down. "Thanks for coming. I know this situation is frustrating for everyone. Let me start by explaining what's going on." I pulled up a map on my TV screen showing the property boundaries and the easement. "This trail crosses my property for approximately 150 yards before continuing onto BLM land. The easement was established in 1987 as private access for subdivision lot owners. It is not HOA property. It is not public property, and it predates the HOA by 7 years." "That's irrelevant." Patricia stood up. "That trail has been used by this community since this neighborhood was built. You have no right to block access. I have every right to control what happens on my property, just like the HOA has the right to control what happens on HOA property. In fact, you just exercised that right by seizing my snow machine from what you claim is HOA trail land. That's completely different. You were violating HOA covenants. And now people are crossing my property without permission, which is trespassing. See how that works?" The room erupted in arguments. People were shouting about property rights and community access and how I was being unreasonable. I let them yell for about a minute, then held up my hand. "Here's what I'm proposing. Any property owner in the original Birchwood subdivision can apply for a free annual access permit. The permit allows you to cross my property to access BLM lands. You can use snow machines, ATVs, side-by-sides, whatever you want. All I ask is that you respect the property, don't litter, don't tear up the trail, and follow basic safety rules." The room got quieter. People looked confused. "That's it?" Robert, the guy who had called Monday, asked. "Just a permit. That's it. For subdivision property owners. However, the HOA is not a property owner. The HOA is a corporate entity. If the HOA wants its members to have access to this trail, the HOA needs to negotiate with me separately." Patricia's face was turning red. This is extortion. No, this is property rights. The same property rights you used to justify stealing my $30,000 snow machine. By the way, that machine is still sitting in your impound lot racking up $50 a day in storage fees based on what you claim are legitimate HOA rules. I'm simply applying the same logic. My property, my rules. Martin Hughes spoke up for the first time. He had a surprisingly deep voice. What exactly would the HOA need to do to negotiate access? 3 things. First, return my snow machine with all fees waived. Second, amend the HOA covenants to explicitly allow property owners to use motorized vehicles on the HOA trails for the purpose of accessing BLM land. Third, issue a formal apology for the unlawful seizure of my property. Unlawful. We followed the covenants exactly. Patricia was practically shouting. You enforced a rule that effectively prevents property owners from accessing federal public lands that they have a legal easement to reach. That's arguably an unconstitutional restriction on access to public resources. My attorney is very interested in exploring that angle if necessary. This was a bluff. Chen and I hadn't discussed that specific angle, but it sounded good, and it had the desired effect. Patricia sat down hard, and Martin and Brenda exchanged worried looks. A woman in the back raised her hand. She was probably in her 30s, wearing a practical fleece jacket. I just want to make sure I understand. If I fill out a permit application, I can keep using the trail like normal. Exactly. I have applications right here. I held up a stack of simple 1-page forms I had printed. Fill it out with your name, address, and what vehicles you'll be using. I'll approve it and email you a permit. Put a copy of the permit in your vehicle and you're good for the whole year. And this is free. For property owners in the subdivision, yes, free. People started moving forward to grab applications. Within minutes, most of the people in the room were filling out forms. Patricia looked like she wanted to explode, but there was nothing she could do. I was offering exactly what everyone wanted, except the HOA. After most people had left, Patricia approached me with Martin and Brenda flanking her like bodyguards. This isn't over, Mr. Zimmerman. The HOA will not be blackmailed into changing our covenants because of your childish revenge scheme. It's not revenge, Patricia. It's property rights. You took my property using HOA rules. I'm controlling access to my property using property law. If you don't like it, you can drive the extra 8 miles around to the northern access point for the BLM trails. 8 miles. Brenda looked shocked. Yeah, that's the next closest access point. Of course, that road isn't maintained in winter, so you would probably need a truck with good clearance. And I think part of it crosses state land that requires a separate permit, but I'm sure you'll figure it out. Martin put a hand on Patricia's arm before she could respond. We'll discuss this with our attorney and get back to you. You do that. In the meantime, my snow machine is costing you $50 a day in storage fees that you'll never collect, and your entire community is now coming to me for permission to access the trails they've been using for years. Balls in your court. They left, and I locked the door behind them, feeling pretty satisfied with how the evening had gone. Over the next week, I processed 83 permit applications. Every single one of them was approved. People were actually pretty friendly about it once they realized I wasn't trying to block access, just control it. Several people even stopped by to chat and tell me stories about run-ins they had with Patricia over the years. I learned that Patricia had fined people for having the wrong color Christmas lights, for parking their RV in their own driveway for more than 24 hours, for letting their grass get too long in the summer, and for having a vegetable garden that was visible from the street. One guy told me she had tried to fine him because his dog barked too much, even though the dog was inside his house, and the complaint had come from Patricia herself, who lived 6 houses away. She just likes power, he told me. Being HOA president is the only power she's ever had in her life, and she abuses the hell out of it. Meanwhile, the HOA hadn't budged. My snow machine was still in impound, now racking up over $700 in storage fees on top of the original $2,500 in fines. I called Chen for an update. I sent them a formal letter demanding return of your property and threatening litigation. They responded with their own letter saying that all actions were taken in accordance with HOA covenants and that they have no obligation to negotiate with you regarding the trail access. So they're going to be stubborn about this. Looks like it. But here's the thing. I did some research, and you were right to push back on those fees. Alaska law requires that HOA fines be reasonable and directly related to the costs imposed by the violation. $2,500 for a first-time covenant violation is excessive by any standard. And $50 a day storage for a snow machine they're keeping in an open lot is equally ridiculous. So, what do? We file a motion in court to have the fees declared invalid and your property returned. It will take a few weeks to get a hearing, but I think we have a strong case. Do it, and make sure we file for recovery of legal fees and costs, way ahead of you. While Chen prepared the legal filings, I focused on making the trail situation as inconvenient as possible for the HOA. I installed a second gate at the point where the trail exited my property onto BLM land. This one had a keypad lock, and I gave the code only to people who had valid permits. This meant that anyone trying to bypass my property and access the trail from a different direction would still hit a locked gate. I also installed better signage explaining that the trail was private property and that use without a permit constituted trespassing under Alaska law. I even looked up the specific statute, Alaska Statute 11.46.320, criminal trespass. In Alaska, criminal trespass is a Class B misdemeanor, punishable by up to 90 days in jail and a fine of up to $2,000. I made sure that statute number was prominently displayed on my signs. The HOA tried to hold an emergency meeting to address the trail crisis, as they were calling it. I wasn't invited, but Robert called me afterward to fill me in. It was a mess, he said, laughing. Patricia tried to get everyone riled up about how you were destroying community access and ruining property values. But then, people started pointing out that they all had permits from you and could use the trail just fine. Someone suggested that maybe the HOA should just negotiate with you, and Patricia lost it. Started yelling about how the HOA doesn't negotiate with bullies. She called me a bully. That's rich. Martin finally got her to calm down, and they voted to hire a lawyer to explore their options. But honestly, most people there thought the whole thing was funny. Patricia's pissed off so many people over the years that seeing someone stand up to her is pretty entertaining. Glad I could provide some entertainment. 2 weeks later, I got a letter from an attorney named Richard Foster representing the Birchwood Estates HOA. The letter was 6 pages of legal posturing, but it boiled down to 3 main points. The HOA believed the easement was public and that I had no right to restrict access. The HOA believed my gate was illegal and I could face fines and legal action if I didn't remove it. And the HOA demanded that I cease all harassment of HOA board members. I forwarded the letter to Chen, who called me an hour later laughing. This is amateur hour stuff. Foster is using boilerplate language and making arguments that don't even apply to Alaska property law. He's trying to scare you into backing down. Is there anything in here I need to worry about? Not really. The easement is clearly private based on the recorded documents. Your gate is on your property and you have every right to install it. And I have no idea what harassment he's talking about unless enforcing your property rights counts as harassment now. So what do we do? I'll send him a response explaining why he's wrong on all counts and reiterating our demand for return of your snow machine. I'll also mention that if the HOA continues to hold your property unlawfully, we'll be seeking additional damages for conversion. Conversion. It's a legal term for wrongfully taking someone's property and depriving them of its use. If we can show that the HOA is acting in bad faith, they could be liable for the full value of the snow machine plus your damages for not being able to use it. I like the sound of that. The legal back and forth continued for another 3 weeks. In the meantime, winter was hitting hard. We got 17 inches of snow in a 4-day period, and temperatures dropped to -35 for almost a week. This made the trail situation even more critical because the northern access route to the BLM trails was now completely impassable. I started getting calls from people who weren't in the original subdivision and therefore didn't qualify for my free permits. These were newer residents whose homes had been built in an expansion area that was technically part of the HOA but had been subdivided after 1987. A guy named Frank called me on a Thursday evening. "Derek, I understand you're having a dispute with the HOA, but I'm not part of that. I just want to be able to take my kids snow machining on the weekends. What do I need to do to get a permit? The easement is legally designated for property owners in the original subdivision. You're not in the original subdivision, so technically you don't have easement rights." So I'm just screwed. I thought about it. Frank sounded like a reasonable guy, and his kids didn't deserve to suffer because of the HOA drama. Tell you what. If you can show me proof that you live in Birchwood Estates and that your property backs up to HOA common area, I'll issue you a permit for $100 a year. $100? Are you kidding? That's less than $10 a month for unlimited trail access all year. The state charges more than that for a parking permit. There was a pause. Okay, fair point. How do I apply? Same form as everyone else. Just note on it that you're in the expansion area and include a check for $100. Over the next week, I got applications from 42 people in the expansion area, all willing to pay. That was over $4,000, which more than covered my legal fees so far. But more importantly, it meant that the vast majority of the neighborhood now had a direct relationship with me for trail access, completely bypassing the HOA. Patricia did not take this well. I came home one evening to find her standing in my driveway with Martin and a third person, a tall man in his 40s wearing a sheriff's deputy uniform. My stomach dropped. Had they actually convinced law enforcement to get involved, Mr. Zimmerman? The deputy said as I got out of my truck. I'm Deputy Williams with the Fairbanks North Star Borough Sheriff's Office. I need to ask you some questions about a complaint we received. What kind of complaint? Miss Hendricks here alleges that you have been threatening residents and extorting money in exchange for access to public trails. She also alleges that you have made threats against HOA board members. I looked at Patricia, who had a smug expression on her face. Those are complete lies, and I can prove it. Sir, I'm going to need you to come down to the station to answer some questions. Am I under arrest? No, sir. We're just investigating a complaint. Then, with all due respect, I'm not going anywhere without my attorney present. Deputy, I'm happy to cooperate with your investigation, but these allegations are false and appear to be harassment. Here's what's really going on. I spent the next 10 minutes explaining the entire situation to Deputy Williams. I showed him the easement documents, the survey, the permit applications, and the letters from the HOA's attorney. I also showed him the documentation of my snow machine being seized and the excessive fees. Williams listened carefully, taking notes. When I was done, he turned to Patricia. "Madam, this sounds like a civil dispute over property rights, not a criminal matter. Mr. Zimmerman appears to have legal documentation supporting his position. He's extorting people. He's charging money for access to public land. He's charging a fee to cross his private property to reach public land, which he's legally entitled to do. It's no different than a private campground charging a fee even though it's next to a public park. What about the threats?" "What threats specifically?" Patricia sputtered. "He threatened to sue the HOA. He threatened to have us arrested." "Those aren't criminal threats, madam. That's civil litigation, which is completely legal. If you believe Mr. Zimmerman is violating the law, you need to address it through civil court, not by filing false criminal complaints." Patricia's face went through several shades of red. "This is ridiculous. He's clearly in the wrong here." Williams closed his notepad. "Madam, I understand you're frustrated, but making false complaints wastes law enforcement resources and could potentially expose you to liability. I suggest you work this out through the appropriate legal channels." He turned to me. "Mr. Zimmerman, sorry to bother you. You're free to go about your business." After they left, I called Chen immediately and told him what happened. "They filed a false police report. That's bold. Is there anything we can do about it? We can mention it in our filings as evidence of bad faith on the HOA's part. A judge won't look favorably on that kind of behavior. How did the deputy handle it?" "He was actually pretty reasonable. Saw right through Patricia's nonsense." "Good. This is actually helpful for our case. It shows a pattern of harassment and overreach by the HOA." Our court date for the snow machine seizure was set for late February, about 6 weeks after the initial incident. In the meantime, I continued processing permit applications and collecting fees from the expansion area residents. The trail system was working perfectly. People had access. I was covering my costs, and the only people being inconvenienced were the HOA board members. I learned through the neighborhood grapevine that Patricia was furious that residents were cooperating with the enemy, as she apparently called it. She had even threatened to fine people for using unauthorized access points, which made no sense because the trail connected to BLM land, and the HOA had no jurisdiction over what people did on federal property. About a week before our court date, I was out checking the gates and clearing snow from the trail when I heard snow machine engines approaching. 2 machines came around the bend, and I recognized one of the riders as Martin Hughes. The other was a younger man I didn't know. They stopped when they saw me. Martin pulled off his helmet. "Derek, can we talk?" "Sure, what's up?" "This is my son, Jason. He's home visiting from college, and I wanted to take him out on the trails like we used to, but I don't have a permit from you. Did you apply for one?" "No. I'm HOA vice president. Patricia would lose her mind if I applied for one of your permits." "So you were just going to run the gate?" Martin looked embarrassed. "The gate was open. I thought maybe." "The gate was open because I'm doing trail maintenance. It's still my property, Martin." "I know. Look, I'm not here to cause trouble. Jason leaves tomorrow, and this is probably the only chance I'll get to take him snow machining this winter. Can we work something out?" I studied them for a moment. Jason looked like a decent kid, probably around 20, and he looked disappointed. Martin, for all his association with Patricia, had always been more reasonable than the HOA president. "Tell you what. Fill out a permit application on your phone. There's a digital version on my website. Pay the $100 fee via Venmo, and I'll approve it right now. You'll have access for the rest of the year." Martin hesitated. If Patricia finds out. Patricia doesn't control your personal decisions, Martin. You're allowed to use a trail across someone's private property if you have permission. There's nothing in the HOA rules that says you can't. He pulled out his phone and spent a few minutes filling out the application. A minute later, my phone buzzed with a Venmo payment notification. I approved his permit and sent him the confirmation email. You're all set. Have fun out there. Thanks, Derek. And for what it's worth, I think Patricia's handling this whole thing wrong. She's too proud to admit that seizing your snow machine was a mistake. Will you vote to return it at the next board meeting? There's no point. Patricia controls the board. It's her and 2 other members who do whatever she says. Brenda and I are outvoted on everything. That sounds frustrating. It is. I'm actually not running for re-election this year. I'm tired of fighting with her. After they left, I thought about what Martin had said. If Patricia had complete control of the board, there was no way they were going to voluntarily return my snow machine or change the covenants. This was going to have to be decided by a judge. The court hearing was on a Thursday morning at the Fairbanks courthouse. Chen and I arrived early and went over our presentation one more time. Patricia was there with Richard Foster, her attorney, and they were conferring in whispers at their table. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Judge Margaret Sinclair. She had a reputation for being no-nonsense and efficient, which Chen said was good for our case. "All right," Judge Sinclair said once everyone was settled. "I've reviewed the filings from both sides. Mr. Chen, this is your motion. Make your argument." Chen stood up and laid out our case clearly. He explained that I had purchased the property with the reasonable expectation of being able to access BLM trails, that the HOA had seized my snow machine based on an overly broad interpretation of the covenants, that the fees were excessive and punitive, and that the HOA was acting in bad faith by refusing to negotiate or allow access to public lands. Foster responded by arguing that the covenants were clear, that I had signed them, and that the HOA had both the right and the obligation to enforce community rules. He claimed the fees were necessary to cover administrative costs and to deter future violations. Judge Sinclair listened to both sides, then started asking questions. "Mr. Foster, what exactly are the administrative costs associated with impounding a snow machine? You're charging $50 per day. What does that money cover?" Foster shuffled his papers. "Storage costs, Your Honor. Administrative overhead, the cost of the impound service. Where is the vehicle being stored? In a lot owned by the HOA. So there are no actual third-party storage costs." "Well, no, but there are opportunity costs for the use of the lot." "Opportunity costs? What else would you be using an empty lot for in the middle of winter in Fairbanks?" Your Honor, the fees are established in the HOA covenants as approved by the membership." "Show me where in the covenants it specifies $50 per day for storage." There was a long pause. "It doesn't specify an exact amount, Your Honor. The board has discretion to set reasonable fees. But is $50 per day reasonable for storing a snow machine in an empty lot?" "The board believed so, Your Honor." Judge Sinclair turned to Patricia, who was sitting rigidly at the table. "Miss Hendricks, you're the HOA president?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Did the board consult with anyone about what a reasonable storage fee would be before setting it at $50 per day? We based it on comparable impound fees in the area. For vehicles impounded by law enforcement and stored at commercial facilities with security, insurance, and overhead costs." Patricia hesitated. "Yes, Your Honor." "You have security at your lot?" "No, Your Honor. Insurance specifically covering impounded vehicles. Our general liability policy covers the lot." but not specifically for impound operations. No, Your Honor. Judge Sinclair made some notes, then looked at both attorneys. Here's my ruling. The HOA had the authority to address what it believed was a covenant violation. However, the fees imposed are clearly excessive and punitive rather than compensatory. Alaska law requires that HOA penalties be reasonable and proportionate. $50 per day to store a snow machine in an unsecured outdoor lot is neither reasonable nor proportionate. She continued, furthermore, I find that the underlying covenant restriction, as applied in this case, may constitute an unreasonable restraint on the property owner's ability to access adjacent public lands to which he has a legal easement. However, that issue is beyond the scope of this motion and would need to be addressed in a separate action. Patricia started to say something, but Foster put a hand on her arm. Therefore, I am ordering the immediate return of Mr. Zimmerman's snow machine with all storage fees waived. The initial fine of $2,000 is reduced to $250, which is more in line with typical HOA violation penalties in this state. The HOA will also pay Mr. Zimmerman's reasonable attorney's fees and costs associated with this motion, to be determined after submission of documentation. Are there any questions? Your Honor, Foster said quickly. The HOA would like to request a stay of the order pending appeal. Request denied. The vehicle will be returned immediately. This hearing is adjourned. Chen and I walked out of the courthouse into the bright February sunshine. It was -10 degrees, but I felt warm with satisfaction. That went even better than I expected, Chen said. Sinclair eviscerated their argument about the fees. And did you catch what she said about the covenant restriction? She's basically saying you might have a case to challenge the entire restriction as unreasonable. Should we file that challenge? Let's see how the HOA responds first. They might be willing to negotiate now that they've lost in court. We drove directly from the courthouse to the HOA office, which was a small building near the neighborhood entrance. Patricia's car was already there. She must have sped the whole way. Inside, Patricia was on the phone speaking in angry tones to someone. When she saw us, she hung up abruptly. We need to make arrangements to retrieve Mr. Zimmerman's snow machine, Chen said professionally. Fine. It's in the lot behind this building. Take it and get out. We'll also need documentation of the reduced fine amount for payment purposes. Patricia printed out a revised invoice with shaking hands and practically threw it across the counter. $250, cash or check. I pulled out my checkbook and wrote the check very slowly, making sure every number and letter was perfect. When I handed it to her, she snatched it without a word. My snow machine was indeed in the lot behind the building, covered with a tarp but otherwise undamaged. I loaded it onto my trailer while Chen watched Patricia through the office window. She's on the phone again, he reported. Looks like a very animated conversation. Probably calling Foster to discuss an appeal. Let her appeal. That ruling was solid. She'll just waste more of the HOA's money. I secured the snow machine and we headed out. I drove straight home and parked the trailer in my garage, then stood there for a moment just looking at my recovered property. It had been almost 2 months since they took it, and I felt vindicated. That evening, I decided to test the trail from start to finish. I fired up the snow machine, which started on the first try, and headed out onto my property toward the back trail. The gate opened smoothly with my key, and I followed the flagged easement route through the woods. The trail was in good shape despite the heavy snow. I had been maintaining it regularly, and several permit holders had thanked me for keeping it groomed. The moonlight reflected off the snow, turning everything blue and silver. The temperature was -20, but with my gear on, I felt comfortable. When I reached BLM land, I opened up the throttle and flew across the open terrain, feeling genuinely happy for the first time since this whole mess started. This was why I had moved to Alaska. This was what I had paid for, and I had fought for it and won. I rode for about 2 hours, exploring trails I had been wanting to try since before the HOA seized my machine. When I finally headed back home, I felt a sense of peace and satisfaction. That peace lasted about 12 hours. The next morning, I woke up to find my gate had been vandalized. Someone had spray-painted "selfish asshole" across it in bright red letters and had tried to break the lock with what looked like a pry bar. They hadn't succeeded in breaking it, but there were deep gouges in the metal. I called the sheriff's office and filed a report. A different deputy came out, took photos, and wrote everything down, but he was honest with me about the chances of finding who did it. Unless you have video footage, it's going to be hard to catch them. You said you have trail cameras. Yeah, pointed at the gate. I pulled up the footage on my phone and my stomach sank. Whoever had done this had known about the cameras. They had spray-painted the lenses first, blocking the view before vandalizing the gate. The footage showed only a brief glimpse of someone in dark clothing and a ski mask, then nothing but black. They knew what they were doing, the deputy said. This was planned, not random. Any idea who might have done it? I have suspicions, but no proof. Related to that HOA dispute from a few weeks ago. Yeah. Well, I'll file the report, but without evidence pointing to a specific person, there's not much we can do. I'd suggest upgrading your security. More cameras, better angles, maybe some lights with motion sensors. After he left, I called Chen and told him what happened. This could actually be good for us if we can prove the HOA was involved. How am I going to prove that? Well, who knows about the cameras? Who would know exactly where they're positioned? I thought about it. I showed Patricia and the board members during our dispute, and anyone who's walked past the gate would see them. But the fact that they were spray-painted first means someone specifically planned to avoid them. Keep documenting everything. If this harassment continues, it strengthens any future claims against the HOA. I spent that afternoon installing 4 additional cameras with better angles and higher resolution. I also installed motion-activated floodlights that would make it much harder for someone to approach unseen. And I bought a heavy-duty steel plate to cover the lock mechanism, making it harder to damage. The new sign I installed was less polite. Private property video surveillance and use trespassers will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Vandalism is a felony. 2 days later, I got a letter from the HOA. It was a notice of violation for unapproved signs on my property. Apparently, my gate signs were too large and not in keeping with the aesthetic character of the neighborhood. I called Chen, laughing. They're trying to find me for my gate signs. Are the signs visible from the street? No. They're at the back of my property, only visible to people using the trail. Then they're not subject to HOA sign restrictions, which typically only apply to street-facing signage. Send me the letter, I'll respond. The harassment continued in small ways over the next few weeks. Someone filed an anonymous complaint that my firewood was stacked improperly. Another anonymous complaint said my truck was leaking oil in my driveway. Each time, the HOA sent me formal violation notices, and each time, Chen sent back letters explaining why the complaints were baseless. They're trying to bury you in paperwork and fines, Chen explained. It's a common HOA harassment tactic. The goal is to make your life so miserable that you give up and move. That's not going to happen. I didn't think so, but we should consider going on a fence. We have enough evidence now to file a harassment claim against the HOA and potentially against Patricia personally. What would that accomplish? It would put them on the defensive for once. And if we can show a pattern of harassment and retaliation, you might be entitled to damages. Plus, it would send a message that you're not going to be pushed around. Do it. Chen filed a comprehensive complaint in civil court alleging harassment, abuse of authority, and retaliation by the HOA. The complaint included the vandalism incident, the false police report, the excessive fines and fees, and the pattern of frivolous violation notices. The HOA's response was to file a countersuit claiming that I was the one harassing them by restricting trail access and creating a hostile environment in the community. We were now fully in legal warfare, and it was going to get expensive. But I had the permit fees from the expansion area residents, and I was prepared to see this through. The neighborhood was increasingly taking sides. Most residents supported me because they had permits and could use the trail without any issues. But there was a vocal minority, mostly Patricia's friends and HOA loyalists, who saw me as a troublemaker destroying the community. Someone created a Facebook group called Save Birchwood Trails that was dedicated to opposing my monopoly on trail access. The group had about 40 members, and they spent most of their time complaining about me and discussing ways to restore community access. I didn't engage with any of it. I just kept processing permit applications, maintaining the trail, and documenting every interaction with the HOA. In early March, something interesting happened. I got an email from Brenda Walsh, the HOA secretary. "Derek, I know we haven't always seen eye to eye on this situation, but I wanted you to know that I agree the HOA has handled this poorly. Patricia has become increasingly difficult to work with, and many of her actions regarding your property have been against my advice. I voted against seizing your Snowmachine, against filing the criminal complaint, and against continuing this legal fight. Unfortunately, I'm outvoted on the board. I wanted you to know that not everyone in the HOA leadership supports what's been happening. I'm not running for re-election this spring, and I hope whoever replaces me has better judgment. Brenda." I forwarded the email to Chen. "This could be useful, very useful. It's evidence that there's dissent within the HOA board, and that Patricia is acting without full support. If this goes to trial, Brenda could potentially be a witness." The annual HOA elections were scheduled for late April. Normally, these were sleepy affairs with the same people running unopposed and getting re-elected. But this year was different. 4 people filed to run for the 3 open board positions, and all 4 were running on platforms of resolving the trail dispute and restoring community harmony. Patricia was not up for re-election as president, but Martin was stepping down as vice president, as he had told me he would. I attended the annual meeting where the elections took place. The community center was packed with over 100 residents, far more than usually attended these meetings. Patricia opened the meeting with a long speech about the challenges the HOA had faced over the past year and how certain residents had placed their personal interests above community welfare. She didn't name me, but everyone knew who she was talking about. Then came the candidate speeches. 3 of the 4 candidates gave measured talks about wanting to work cooperatively and find solutions. The 4th candidate, a woman named Helen Morrison, who was clearly one of Patricia's supporters, gave an angry speech about how the HOA needed to stand firm against bullies and not give in to extortion. The votes were cast by secret ballot, and while they were being counted, there was an open comment period. I raised my hand. Patricia looked like she wanted to ignore me, but there were too many people watching. "Yes, Mr. Zimmerman," I stood up. "I just want to clarify something for everyone here. I have never denied access to anyone who applied for a permit. Over 200 residents now have permits to use the trail across my property, and I've never rejected a single application. I maintain the trail at my own expense. I clear snow, I repair damage, and I do it because I believe in community access to public lands. What I don't believe in is an HOA that seizes personal property without due process and imposes excessive fines as punishment. The courts agreed with me, which is why my snow machine was returned and the fines were reduced by 90%. I'm willing to resolve this situation, but it requires the HOA to acknowledge that their initial actions were wrong. There was applause from about half the room. The other half sat in stony silence. Patricia's face was red. You restrict access to a trail that has been used by this community for decades. I restrict access to my private property, which is my legal right, just as the HOA restricts access to HOA property, which is your legal right. The difference is that I'm willing to grant access to anyone who asks for it. The HOA refuses to let me use their trail under any circumstances. More applause. Patricia looked like she wanted to respond, but the vote counting was complete. The results were announced. The 3 winning candidates were all people who had run on platforms of resolving the dispute. Helen Morrison, Patricia's supporter, came in last. Patricia's face went through a series of expressions, finally settling on barely controlled rage. She adjourned the meeting quickly and left without speaking to anyone. Over the next week, I got calls from 2 of the newly elected board members, asking if I would be willing to meet with them to discuss a resolution. I agreed, and we set up a meeting at a neutral location, a coffee shop in downtown Fairbanks. The 3 new board members were Robert Anderson, the guy who had called me early on in the dispute, Lisa Chen, a professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and David Kim, who owned a local construction company. They were all reasonable people who seemed genuinely interested in ending the conflict. Here's the situation, Robert said. Patricia still has 2 years left in her term as president, and she has 2 supporters on the board who will vote with her on everything. That gives her a 3-to-3 split on most issues, and as president, she breaks ties in her favor. So even with you 3 on the board, she still controls it. For major decisions, yes, but we can make things difficult for her. And we can refuse to approve legal expenses for continuing the lawsuit against you, which might force her hand. What are you proposing? Lisa spoke up. She was in her 30s, with short dark hair and a direct manner. We want to amend the covenants to allow motorized vehicle access to BLM trails. It requires a vote of the membership, and we think we have the support. Most people just want to use the trails without drama. And in exchange, we'd like you to guarantee permanent access across your property for HOA members. Not just permits that you could theoretically revoke, but an actual recorded easement. I thought about it. I'd be willing to grant an easement for property owners in the HOA, but I want some protections. The easement would be contingent on the HOA maintaining their trails for BLM access and not interfering with residents' ability to reach federal lands. If the HOA ever restricts access again, like they did with my snow machine, the easement terminates. David nodded. That seems fair. We'd also need to address the pending lawsuits. I'm willing to drop my harassment claim if the HOA drops their countersuit and pays my legal fees to date. We'd have to convince Patricia to agree to that. That's your problem, not mine. I'm not dropping my claim unless the HOA agrees to settle. We talked for another hour, hammering out the details. By the end, we had a rough framework for a settlement. The new board members seemed optimistic that they could get it passed, despite Patricia's opposition. 2 weeks later, the HOA held a special meeting to vote on the proposed covenant amendment. The amendment would explicitly allow property owners to use motorized vehicles on HOA trails for the purpose of accessing BLM lands, subject to reasonable rules about noise, hours of operation, and environmental protection. I attended the meeting but didn't speak. I just sat in the back and watched. Patricia argued passionately against the amendment, claiming it would destroy property values and create a dangerous precedent of letting individual property owners dictate HOA policy. But when the vote was called, it wasn't even close. The amendment passed with over 70% approval. Patricia looked stunned. In 12 years as HOA president, she had never lost a major vote. After the meeting, Robert approached me. The amendment passed, but we still need to work out the details of the easement and the legal settlement. Patricia's refusing to cooperate, but we think we can proceed without her support if we can get a fourth vote on the board. How are you going to do that? We're going to call for a special election to fill Martin's vacant vice president position early. If we can get someone elected who supports the settlement, we'll have 4 votes to Patricia's 2, and we won't need her. The special election was scheduled for early May. Patricia nominated Helen Morrison, her supporter from the previous election. The opposition nominated a guy named Frank Torres, the same Frank who had called me months ago asking about permits for his kids. The campaign was brief, but intense. Helen's platform was loyalty to Patricia and maintaining HOA authority. Frank's platform was common sense solutions and ending unnecessary conflicts. Frank won with 63% of the vote. At the next board meeting, which I attended, Frank made a motion to approve the settlement agreement with me. The motion passed 4-2, with only Patricia and her remaining supporter voting against it. The settlement included 1. The HOA officially acknowledged that the seizure of my Snowmachine had been handled inappropriately and agreed to revise their enforcement procedures to include more due process protections. 2. The covenant amendment allowing motorized vehicle access to BLM trails was officially adopted and recorded. 3. I would grant a permanent easement across my property for HOA members to access BLM trails, subject to reasonable rules and contingent on the HOA maintaining their own trail access. 4. All pending lawsuits would be dismissed with prejudice, meaning neither side could refile them. 5. The HOA would pay my legal fees, which totaled just over $18,000. Patricia refused to sign the settlement papers, but as Frank pointed out, the board had voted to approve it, and she didn't have the authority to block it. The papers were signed by the 4 board members who supported it, which was sufficient under HOA rules. Chen filed the dismissal papers with the court, and just like that, the legal battle was over. But the personal battle with Patricia was not quite finished. A week after the settlement was finalized, I was out working on my property when a car pulled into my driveway. It was Patricia. She got out and walked toward me with that same sour expression she always wore. "I wanted to tell you personally that you haven't won anything," she said without preamble. "You bullied this community into giving you what you wanted, and you should be ashamed of yourself. Patricia, I exercised my legal property rights. The same rights you tried to use against me when you seized my Snowmachine. That was completely different. I was enforcing legitimate HOA rules. Rules that a judge said were excessive and potentially unconstitutional. Rules that 70% of the community voted to change. Face it, Patricia, you were wrong and you're mad that you got called out on it. I have been HOA president for 12 years. I have dedicated my time to this community, and this is how I'm repaid. By being undermined and disrespected. You weren't undermined. You were held accountable. There's a difference. She stood there for a moment, and I could see her struggling with something. Finally, she said, "I'm resigning as HOA president effective immediately. I can't work with a board that doesn't respect my authority. That's probably for the best. You've destroyed this community's cohesion. I hope you're happy." She turned and walked back to her car. As she was getting in, I called out, "Patricia." She looked back. "For what it's worth, I think you probably started out wanting to help the community. But somewhere along the way, you forgot that being HOA president means serving the residents, not controlling them. Maybe take some time to think about that." She didn't respond. She just got in her car and drove away. I never saw Patricia Hendricks again. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved to Arizona a few months later to be closer to her daughter. Robert Anderson was elected as the new HOA president, and under his leadership, the HOA took on a much more collaborative tone. The covenant enforcement became more reasonable, the fines became less punitive, and people generally seemed happier. The trail system worked exactly as planned. I maintained the easement across my property, and the HOA maintained their trails. The recorded easement meant that future property owners would have guaranteed access, which actually increased property values in the neighborhood once people realized that trail access was now permanent and protected. I continued to charge the $100 annual fee for expansion area residents who weren't covered by the original easement, which seemed fair since I was maintaining the trail at my own expense. Nobody complained because $100 for year-round trail access was a bargain. The vandalism never happened again. I never found out who had spray painted my gate, but my suspicion was that it had been either Patricia herself or someone acting on her instructions. With her gone, the harassment stopped completely. That summer, I ran into Brenda Walsh at the grocery store. She smiled when she saw me. "Derek, how are you? Doing well. How about you?" "Much better now that I'm off the HOA board. That whole situation was so stressful. I'm glad you guys worked it out." "Me too. Thanks for your email, by the way." It meant a lot to know that not everyone on the board was against me. Patricia was impossible to work with. Everything had to be her way or no way. The board is much healthier now with Robert in charge. We chatted for a few more minutes, and as we were saying goodbye, she added, "You know, what you did took a lot of courage. Standing up to an HOA is not easy, and a lot of people would have just given up and moved. You showed people that HOA boards aren't all powerful and that residents have rights too. That's an important lesson." As I drove home with my groceries, I thought about everything that had happened over the past 6 months. I had moved to Alaska for peace and freedom, and instead, I had ended up in a legal battle with my homeowners association. But in the end, I had gotten what I wanted: the ability to use my property as I intended, access to public lands, and a snow machine that was parked safely in my garage. That winter was everything I had hoped for when I bought the property. I spent countless hours exploring the BLM trail system, often running into neighbors who would wave and thank me for maintaining the trail access. I joined a local snow machine club and made friends with people who shared my love of Alaska's winter wilderness. One cold January evening, almost exactly a year after the HOA had seized my snow machine, I was out on the trails watching the northern lights dance across the sky. The temperature was -30, but I was warm in my gear, and the snow reflected the green and purple lights like a living painting. I thought about Patricia and her need to control everything, and I felt something like pity. She had spent 12 years trying to manage every detail of the neighborhood, trying to force people to live according to her vision of how things should be. And in the end, all that control had gotten her was frustration and resentment. I, on the other hand, had fought for my freedom and won. I had stood up for my rights, endured the harassment and legal battles, and come out the other side with exactly what I wanted. As I headed back toward home, I passed several other riders on the trail. We exchanged waves and nods, fellow Alaskans enjoying the winter wilderness. This was what I had moved here for. This was what I had fought for. And standing there on my own trail, on my own property, with the northern lights overhead and the sound of Snowmachine engines echoing through the forest, I felt completely, perfectly free. The settlement with the HOA held up over time. The easement was recorded with the county and became a permanent part of the property records. When real estate agents showed homes in Birchwood Estates, they now advertised guaranteed access to thousands of acres of BLM trails, which became a major selling point for the neighborhood. I continued to live on my property and use the trails regularly. I never had another conflict with the HOA. Robert served as president for 3 years before stepping down, and his successors continued the more reasonable approach to governance that he had established. I eventually became friends with many of my neighbors, including Robert, Frank, Lisa, and David. We formed an unofficial trail maintenance committee that worked to keep the entire trail system in good condition, coordinating with the BLM and the state to ensure the routes were safe and well marked. The story of my fight with the HOA became something of a legend in Fairbanks. Other people who were having disputes with their HOAs would sometimes reach out to me for advice, and I would always tell them the same thing. Know your rights, document everything, don't back down when you're in the right, and be willing to fight for what's important to you. Michael Chen, my attorney, ended up specializing in HOA disputes after our case. He said that my case had taught him that HOA boards often overreach their authority and that residents need strong legal protection. He went on to win several other cases against abusive HOAs, establishing important precedents for homeowner rights in Alaska. As for my $30,000 snow machine, it's still running strong. I take meticulous care of it, and every time I fire it up and head out onto the trails, I remember the fight I went through to be able to use it. It makes every ride a little bit sweeter. The last time I checked, there were over 300 active trail permits for my property easement. 300 families who can access public lands because I stood up for my rights and refused to be bullied by an overzealous HOA president. That's not just a personal victory. That's a win for everyone who believes in property rights, in reasonable governance, and in the idea that HOA boards should serve their communities, not rule them. I still live on my 5 acres in Birchwood Estates, Alaska. I still love the long winter nights, the northern lights, and the endless miles of trail that wind through the wilderness. And I still remember the day I watched 3 people load my snow machine onto a trailer, and the moment I decided I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Sometimes standing up for yourself is difficult. Sometimes it's expensive. Sometimes it means months of stress and conflict and legal battles. But sometimes it's absolutely worth it. And sitting in my log home, watching the snow fall outside my window, knowing that my snow machine is safely in my garage and that I can ride whenever I want, wherever I want, I can honestly say it was worth every penny, every hour, and every ounce of effort. Freedom is never free, but sometimes the price of fighting for it is the best investment you'll ever make.